Let's bring in Gerald Steinberg, Professor of Politics at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. Professor, thank you for joining us. So the question now of regime change, and the point that General Keane raises there, is that if you do change the regime, you could end up with something even worse. What's your take?
Well, first of all, we're in new uncharted territory. This regime has been in charge of Iran for over 45 years. It's been a regime of hell, a regime of terror. They built this ring of fire, the Shiite arc. Your guests before talked about that. That's all gone now. And they really don't know what to do. It's hard to predict where they're going to go or how they're going to react. If they are willing to risk the regime completely, they may lash out. But there are alternatives. I'm less pessimistic than the way you put it and the way a lot of people do it, because that's really, if you say that there's a chance of a worse regime coming up, you do nothing. And then you don't open up the opportunity for a much better system, a system that has some degree of freedom. Iran is a different country than we're used to dealing with in the Arab Middle East. They're not Arabs. They do have something called civil society. They have protest movements. Those protest movements brought tens or even hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets every few years, every time the regime steals an election, every time they very visibly harass and worse than harass, they mistreat and they execute women. So you see that there's for a long time, been building an anti-regime group within Iran, a large population that wants to see them gone. How that translates into a new and different political process is difficult to predict. The overthrow of the Shah was, you could see towards the end of his regime, that it was fading, that he and his regime didn't have the power to maintain their ability to stay in office. But nobody predicted, at least nobody that I know, predicted that it would become a radical Islamic fanatic jihadist regime that we saw that would spend all this money trying to get nuclear weapons and build thousands of missiles and continually attack Israel and threaten to attack the United States. So where this goes from here is very hard to predict. But I think my general approach to these sorts of situations is, let's see what we can do, and mainly what the Iranian people can do to rid themselves of this very horrible group of leaders. And let's try to develop a situation to help those people to come up with something that's better. We may be seeing something similar that's happening in Syria. That may be a better example. Libya, of course, is a worse example, at least not a good example.
Hey, this is Freya. Thank you so much for joining us. We just saw Iran's foreign minister go in for a meeting with Putin in the last couple of hours, and the Kremlin have said essentially that they'll provide Iran with support as they need it. Very vague about exactly what Russia will do to support Iran. Clearly, Iran doesn't look like they're winning this war. So how do you think Russia is going to respond, and what kind of support do you think Russia will be providing Iran other than just condemnations of Israel and America?
Well, I'll start with a flippant comment that Russia and Putin could easily provide asylum for the regime, the foreign minister, the Ayatollah, as he did for the Syrian, for Assad and his entourage not too long ago. That's a possibility. But Russia really is a very weak power right now, and you discussed that earlier on the panel. They really don't have a lot to be able to offer. They're up to their ears. They can't win in Ukraine. They thought they'd have a walk-off in Ukraine a couple of years ago when they invaded. They're using Iranian weapons. One of their main weapons that they use is to attack with the Iranian-made drones. That means they can't even make their own drones. And the Iranian drones are being shot down by the Israelis, and that capability, that technology, will be transferred to Ukraine as well. It'll be easier for Ukraine to shoot down Russian drones and other equipment. So there's very little Russia can offer. They don't have money to offer. They don't have any kind of political framework. They can veto resolutions in the UN. Big deal. That's not going to help save the regime or prevent further attacks. We've got a situation now where the Israeli Air Force is flying at will over all of Iran, not just the western part closer to Israel, but also the eastern part. It's like a duck shoot. They're knocking off piece by piece all of the military assets, all the security assets the Iranians have. So going to Russia is more of a symbolic act. Well, I can't go anyplace else. Nobody else wants us. I'll go to Russia and I'll pretend like it was 20 years ago. And then the allies could get together. They have the Americans supporting the Israelis, and you have Russia and maybe China supporting the Arab states, or in this case, Iran. That's where we are, but I don't think it's anything more than symbolic.
Gerald, Joe here. Thank you also for joining us. I wonder if, obviously, the most desirable resolution to this would be regime change from the bottom up, where a more benign, more pro-democratic, liberal authority took the place of the Ayatollah and the president. We saw in 2009 the Green Revolution in Iran that sort of presaged the Arab Spring elsewhere, and yet those movements often started with students, with Democrats, with liberally minded young people, and were very quickly overrun by extremists, by ISIS and ISIS-linked militants. That's obviously the fear that we heard voiced previously by Jack Keane. What do you think? How can the local movements in Iran prevent that power flowing to whoever is prepared to use it most extremely?
Before we get to that, there's what I say is probably a more likely, unfortunately, scenario, and that is the regime holds on by its fingernails. It holds on through greater repression, and it continues this war of attrition of sending a missile or two over to Israel every couple of, maybe once or twice a day, which sends Israelis running into shelters, doesn't do very much damage, if any, today. But they continue to have this ability of threatening, of terror. And that also perhaps using their terror cells abroad and attacking soft targets abroad may be part of this war of attrition. So I'm more concerned about the regime hanging on and trying to at least rehabilitate itself by showing that it can strike out, as opposed to a regime change, which is obviously much better for the Iranian people and for the region. I think what the outside world can do some to support the Iranian dissidents. And it really hasn't done enough. I think during the 2009 period you mentioned, the American government did not really offer very much. The West, the freedom-loving democratic countries in the West, didn't really do much more than verbal support for the Iranian dissidents who are out there trying to overthrow the regime and get their freedom back. That has to change. There has to be some sort of a plan. I would say the discussion among Western democracies that have a little bit of a backbone. You're going to have to work with Trump. You don't like Trump, that's too bad. I'm not saying it to you. But governments, including the Australian government, that's the only show in town. Yeah. Europe clearly is incapable of doing anything, and they'd have to do a lot of changes to become involved. And there it has to be done carefully, because too much overt external help delegitimizes the internal forces against the regime. So it's got to be a very, very careful balance walking across this bridge. I think it doesn't make too much sense to try to predict how that's going to go. Just like nobody could predict the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and what's happened in other parts of the world, Libya, all those things. We had the Arab Spring. Libya overthrew Gaddafi, and it's a total chaos. Most of the other, as you said, most of the other Arab Spring movements were squashed by the powers that be, by the more regime-based tyrants that wanted to prevent any kind of change in the power of the elites that control these countries. And that might be the case in Iran, so it's going to be very difficult.
Gerald Steinberg, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you for your insights. It's been excellent to have you. Professor of Politics at Bar-Ilan University.